Today is my Thanksgiving podcast. It's being aired a few days late, but I think the Thanksgiving atmosphere is still around, and it may be a little longer than usual, although I have one question only. The question is, given the desperate state of the United States today and the future we seem to be heading toward, do we still have anything to be thankful for? And my answer is yes, we do. But it's not obvious what it is. So let me explain. Well, in the context of giving thanks today, the first thing that comes to mind is the Founding Fathers. As you know, I think you might know from Objectivist writings, the philosopher behind the Founding Fathers was Aristotle. His philosophy went into eclipse and came back again and was finally applied by philosophers and picked up by the Founding Fathers during the period that is called the Enlightenment. The result was the first country founded on ideas. Our Founding Fathers were not tribal chiefs or power-lusting conquerors or a revelation-encrusted priesthood. They were thinkers of the Enlightenment. They were jeered at by traditionalists on both sides of the Atlantic, but they proposed to create a nation whose institutions would be without precedent and to do it on the basis of a theory, an abstract theory of the nature of man and the universe. The United States, they decided, would be the first nation to have an avowed philosophic meaning. Of course, the philosophy that they accepted was the philosophy of the Enlightenment. In essence, secularism, reality and the proper object of man's concern is this world and this life. Reason, the only oracle of man, in Ethan Allen's phrase, and man's proper goal, the pursuit of happiness, of his own happiness. These were the essentials of Aristotle's philosophy, and these were the essentials of the Enlightenment. The political expression the Founding Fathers saw was a country of limited government, a country of liberty, a country where men had the right to pursue their wealth, pursue profit, pursue their own achievements, and enjoy the results, and a government whose only function was to protect them in that pursuit. Now, this, as the basis of a country, led to a distinctive kind of people, a distinctive character, a distinctive American character that has often been noted as different from anything else we see around us or in the past. Ayn Rand called it the American sense of life. And by sense of life, she means, in effect, an unconscious philosophy, a philosophy that hasn't reached the form of explicit, well-known ideas to the people, but that in some terms they have that feeling, and that feeling in some way motivates them. That's where the country started. What happened then? The Enlightenment faded and disappeared, is forgotten. Things have gotten intellectually ever worse. The ideas of the Enlightenment are no longer on the intellectual scene at all. So we can thank our Founding Fathers as a historic force, but the question is raised today, what is left of their achievements? Since you don't see them in the universities, the museums in Washington, etc. Obviously, we are in a desperate state, and the Founding Fathers would be hard-pressed even to recognize it anymore. So I think the question we have to ask is, what is left in the souls or the subconscious of Americans, even if they don't know it explicitly? Is the Enlightenment spirit still alive today, even if underground? Now, that's a question I consider in my current book, The Dim Hypothesis, and I'll sketch in the kinds of evidence that you can see. You could write a whole book on this, but here's some. and more or less condensing now from my chapter on this topic. On the positive side, the main evidence is the long-term split, a unique split, between the intellectuals and the common sense-oriented U.S. public. And that is a split without counterpart in Europe, a split between the intellectuals and the public. And you can see it here by the public's firm rejection of so many European trends that were uncontroversial over there. You can see the split by the time lag necessary for these European corruptions to be adopted by American institutions and government. I'm talking of anti-rational trends such as non-objective art, non-cognitive education, sex-interpreted man, obviously Freud, class war-interpreted society, obviously Marx, and all the rest. Now, our intellectuals gulped it all in. And so, from that point of view, they regarded America always as backwards and had a contempt for their own country without parallel elsewhere. The public is Philistines, according to them, and it's, quote, materialists. And that's true in the sense that Americans are more respectful than men elsewhere of wealth as a moral achievement. I think Americans are less envious, more eager to become rich by their own action, more confident of their ability to succeed in life. You can just look at the much greater proportion of small business in the United States than anywhere else. Doesn't that suggest a special American premium on initiative, self-reliance, the entrepreneurial spirit? And if we go to more narrow politics, you can see, I think, that Americans, as a rule, are notably less eager than others to subordinate their individuality to ever bigger government. Here again, on almost every issue, from the original birth here of the welfare state under FDR to its latest expression, Obama's socialized medicine, America has lagged well behind Europe. The intellectuals complain that they have had to drag this country into the future against the unwillingness of a reluctant public. Now, they have succeeded one after the other in dragging us, but they had to drag. Sartre, the French existentialist, famously complained that Americans did not believe in evil. In other words, in human impotence and depravity as the forces moving men. And that's a charge which speaks directly to the role of the Enlightenment in shaping the American subconscious. Because whenever Sartre would present what he regarded as insoluble dilemma of life, the Americans would always come back and say, we can fix problems by the use of reason and logic and thought. And his attitude was, Americans are hopeless. That is a naivety that I can't deal with. Okay, now let's look at the other side of the question. There is still a split between the intellectuals here and the public, but its root no longer seems to be primarily, certainly not totally, the public's common sense as against the intellectuals' irrationality. It seems more and more to be the public's growing embrace of religion, which the intellectuals don't accept. Now, for the evidence of that, I refer you to chapter 15 of my book. I think there is less respect now for the pursuers of profit and the owners of wealth today. There's greater willingness to believe all the detractors of among businessmen, detractors of businessmen, entrepreneurs, profit seekers. There's a greater willingness to sacrifice or to let be taken away without protest material goods demanded by fashionable groups, ecological, ethnic, economic, whatever. There is less confidence, I think, in the individual's ability to achieve values on his own, by his own action. And, of course, given the fact that the government has become so massive, people have begun to sense the decline of Americanism, the decline of the country at home, and our ability to cope with enemies abroad. And as a result of that, I think there's a sense of futility, certainly of anxiety, of despair. Much of the public now does believe in evil, at least up to a point, in the sense of they believe there are crucial problems that are insoluble, hopeless to deal with. There's nothing we can do. Now, in regard to politics, much of the public still avows its opposition to big government, even though most of the country's active subgroups regularly demand more and more handouts and policies that they think are beneficial to themselves. So we have this spectacle. On the one hand, Americans are proud of their nation's long history of upholding men's rights, and they venerate the Constitution that protects them, and in some sense they sincerely do that. But on the other hand, they've had a long Christian and more recently egalitarian brainwashing, and so they have less and less of a problem with the country's history of increasingly violating the very rights that they worship the Constitution for including. Now, the optimistic interpretation is they don't know what they're doing and they could be straightened out. The pessimistic interpretation of this kind of contradiction is that the Enlightenment ideas are now largely rhetoric and that people actually have no coherent ideas or feelings on the subject. In any event, we can't deny the evidence of the public's change of character across time. People today accept, whether happily or passively or even unknowingly, they accept countless developments that their ancestors just a few generations back would have found horrendous or even inconceivable. Think of our grandfathers, I'm thinking in the 50s or the 60s, accustomed as they were to high school graduates with a reasonable literacy and knowledge. Could they even have imagined the teenagers who are turned out today, the deconceptualized teenagers, who rank in a recent test 27th in educational standing in the industrial world, right behind Bulgaria? Or take another example. Having participated in the nationwide uproar in the 40s when Truman attempted to take over the steel mills, do you think our grandparents could have imagined a time when a good part of the public cheered Washington's takeover of the banks, the auto industry, Wall Street, and who knows what next? Oh, one more, even more horrendous example. If you lived through the nationwide urgency to go to war and defend this country after Pearl Harbor, and to go to war, it had to be unconditional surrender. There's no idea of negotiation. Do you think they could have imagined the American public's acquiescence in two successive presidents who had either no response to 9/11 beyond a few empty words or outright shameless appeasement of its perpetrators? They wouldn't have tolerated it. Whatever else is true, Americans today would be unrecognizable to the founding fathers that they extol. So how do I sum it up? The evidence in regard to the American sense of life is incoherent, being on its face almost systematically contradictory. What does that mean then about the sense of life? Is it still there as a viable factor in history? Or has it faded to the point of historical irrelevance? Now, I've sketched in some of the indications as to why there is some evidence in favor of both of these interpretations, but not conclusive evidence of both. My conclusion, to put it briefly, rests on the idea of the distinction between possible, probable, and certain. Probable is when you have some but not a lot evidence, as against arbitrary when you have none. Probable is when you have a preponderance of evidence. Certainty is when you have all as conclusive. And I'd say, given the situation we have today on this question, including the perverse ambiguities, only one conclusion seems to me permissible, and that is, it is possible that the Enlightenment viewpoint, possible, not arbitrary to say this, it is possible that the Enlightenment viewpoint is widespread and waiting within the American subconscious. It is possible that it has not atrophied to a state of historical irrelevance. But at this point, as Ayn Rand said 40 years ago, it is impossible to tell, and it is even more now because the better parts have atrophied more. So what does that leave us? It leaves us a possibility, maybe. What we can thank the Founding Fathers for, even given the whole state of the world since, is that they put so powerful and rational a base in this country that we still have a maybe. Now you say, well, isn't that a very pessimistic conclusion? Well, that's the issue of the glass being half full and the half empty. Because the negative side, maybe not, implies the maybe is. And let me say we have, I think, an extra strong maybe here, because the Aristotelian ideas which made the Founding Fathers possible are now reformulated by Ayn Rand, stripped of all the contradictions of the ages in the form of objectivism, and therefore are present in their most powerful form, so that if there is a remnants of a sense of life to be worked with, we now, if the potential is there, we now have the activating element, and if we could put the two together, we could redirect the country. So we have two powerful potentials today. A philosophy which may be able to turn things around, and a people who may be ready to accept it. And you cannot underestimate the reality of these two factors. If you looked at Germany or Russia or even England on each of these points, of course they had no objectivism, but they would never be receptive to objectivism. It's too counter to everything they believe. So there was no ideas and no public that would have been receptive even if they were there, which is why they all go the way they go. And so I think we have something to be thankful for. We can be thankful for the fact that we have a possible future, a possible way out, because we were given such a fantastic start. And on this basis, I want to say still, thank you, Thomas Jefferson. In the light of today's hot debate as to whether taxes should be raised only for the middle class and not for the evil people who make over $250,000, I can't resist quoting you from one of the main founders of the American Revolution and later a president, John Adams. I just want you to hear this without comment from me in contrast to anything that you hear or read today. I'm quoting him now. It is agreed that the end of all government is the good and ease of the people in a secure enjoyment of their rights without oppression. But it must be remembered that the rich are people as well as the poor, that they have rights as well as others, that they have as clear and as sacred a right to their large property as others have to theirs, which is smaller, that oppression to them is as possible and as wicked as to others, unquote. Thank you, John Adams.